The single father had less than $80 in his checking account when he found a wallet containing $40,000 in cash, and the woman who owned it never imagined the man returning it needed that money far more than she did. Daniel Harper spotted the wallet beneath a shopping cart in the parking lot of a grocery store on a cold Thursday evening. The leather case was expensive enough to catch anyone's attention. When he picked it up, he immediately noticed the weight. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, several credit cards, and identification belonging to Victoria Bennett. Daniel stared at the money for a moment longer than he wanted to admit. Earlier that morning, he had opened another utility bill at the kitchen table and quietly moved it beneath a stack of overdue notices. His 10-year-old daughter, Emily, had pretended not to notice. Children often saw more than adults realized. Yet after a brief pause, Daniel closed the wallet and slipped it into his jacket. Not because he intended to keep it, because someone would be terrified when they realized it was missing. 20 minutes later, he drove his aging pickup truck across town and arrived at the address listed on the identification card. The property looked more like a private estate than a house. Security lights illuminated long stone walkways. A luxury SUV sat near the entrance. Daniel was greeted by a visibly anxious woman speaking rapidly with a member of her staff. Relief washed across her face the instant she saw the wallet in his hands. "You found it?" she asked. Daniel simply nodded and handed it over. Victoria immediately checked the contents. Every dollar remained untouched. For a second she looked confused, almost suspicious, as though honesty on that scale no longer made sense. "Do you realize how much money was in here?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "It wasn't mine." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck before she could offer a reward. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet something about it stayed with Victoria long after he disappeared into the darkness. Most people thanked her because of her wealth. Most people wanted something. This man had not even introduced himself. Back home, Daniel found Emily asleep at the kitchen table beside unfinished homework. A school permission slip rested near her elbow. So did a handwritten reminder from her teacher about an upcoming science trip. Daniel carried her gently to bed before returning to the kitchen. There, beneath the pile of bills, sat a medical statement from a recent specialist appointment. He stared at the amount due and quietly closed his eyes. Then he picked up a pencil and began adjusting the household budget again. He removed a few expenses, delayed others. Somehow he always found a way. The next morning before sunrise, Daniel packed Emily's lunch and tucked a small note inside her lunchbox. He did it every day. Sometimes the notes were jokes, sometimes encouragement. Today's note simply read, "Good things grow slowly. Be patient with yourself." Later, after dropping Emily off near the school hallway entrance, he headed to work as a maintenance technician at a manufacturing facility outside town. Few people there knew much about his life. Fewer still knew why an old framed engineering certificate remained hidden inside a drawer at home. Daniel never talked about it. He preferred focusing on what needed to be done today. That afternoon, Victoria could not stop thinking about the man who returned her wallet. Something about the encounter felt incomplete. She asked her assistant to identify him using security footage from the property gate. By evening she had a name. Daniel Harper. Maintenance worker. Widower. Father. Nothing remarkable on paper. Yet when she looked at the image captured by the camera, she noticed something unusual. The man carrying $40,000 had looked exactly the same before returning it as he did afterward. No hesitation. No excitement. No regret. And for reasons she could not explain, Victoria suddenly found herself wondering what kind of life could produce that sort of character. The answer, she would soon discover, was far more extraordinary than the wallet itself. Victoria Bennett expected curiosity to fade after a day or two. Instead, it grew stronger. By Monday morning, she found herself thinking about Daniel Harper between executive meetings, budget reviews, and conference calls. Returning the wallet had been unusual. Walking away from a reward had been even stranger. Yet what unsettled her most was how ordinary he seemed. People with exceptional character were often celebrated. Daniel appeared determined to remain invisible. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued exactly as it had before. At 5:30 each morning he woke before sunrise, packed Emily's lunch, and checked her inhaler before she left for school. The small two-bedroom house carried traces of constant budgeting. Coupons sat beside grocery lists. Utility bills remained stacked neatly near the kitchen calendar. When the water heater began making strange noises one morning, Daniel repaired it himself before work rather than paying for a service call. Emily watched from the doorway while eating cereal. She had learned long ago that her father could fix almost anything. Yet he never treated his skills as something special. To him, solving problems was simply part of taking care of the people who depended on him. After dropping Emily off at school, Daniel drove his aging pickup truck to the manufacturing facility where he worked maintenance. Midway through the shift, a production line unexpectedly shut down. Supervisors gathered around the malfunctioning equipment, while delays began costing the company money. Daniel quietly studied the system for several minutes, then suggested a solution. Within half an hour, the line was running again. Several managers thanked him. Daniel nodded and returned to work. One supervisor remarked that he often seemed overqualified for the position. Daniel simply smiled and changed the subject. By late afternoon, he stopped at the grocery store before heading home. While reaching for a carton of milk, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift several heavy bags into her cart. Without hesitation, he helped load them and then carried the groceries to her car. The woman thanked him repeatedly. Daniel never mentioned it afterward. At home, another challenge waited. Emily's science trip payment was due by the end of the week. The amount was not enormous, but combined with medical expenses and household bills, it created another difficult choice. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table reviewing numbers while Emily worked on homework nearby. After several minutes, he quietly crossed something off the family budget. It was the small amount he occasionally set aside for replacing his worn-out truck tires. The field trip stayed. The tires could wait. Emily never saw him make the adjustment. Across town, Victoria's curiosity finally overcame her hesitation. She instructed her assistant to gather publicly available information about Daniel. Nothing dramatic appeared. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No hidden business interests. Just years of steady employment, volunteer work at community events, and a reputation for reliability. The simplicity almost frustrated her. Then one detail caught her attention. Every Saturday morning, Daniel volunteered at a local church food pantry. No publicity. No recognition. Just service. Victoria found herself staring at the report longer than necessary. The next Saturday, she drove past the church parking lot out of curiosity. She told herself she only wanted to understand the man who returned her wallet. Yet when she saw Daniel unloading boxes of donated food, while laughing with children and helping elderly residents carry supplies to their cars, something shifted. For the first time, she realized the wallet might not be the story at all. It might simply be the first clue. And as she watched Daniel kneel to help a little boy tie a loose shoe before returning to work, Victoria made a decision she could not fully explain. She wanted to know who he really was. What she did not realize was that following that question would eventually lead her to a truth far bigger than anything she expected to find. Victoria Bennett told herself she was only passing by the church parking lot again because she happened to be nearby. The explanation sounded reasonable until she realized she had adjusted her entire Saturday schedule to make it happen. When she arrived, volunteers were already unloading donations from pickup trucks and organizing food boxes beneath white tents. Daniel Harper was exactly where she expected him to be. Not directing people. Not seeking attention. Simply working. He carried supplies, repaired a loose table leg, and helped elderly residents load groceries into their cars with the same quiet focus he seemed to bring to everything else. Victoria remained near the edge of the lot, observing without introducing herself. Then something unexpected happened. A young girl ran toward Daniel holding a half-finished poster board. Emily. Daniel immediately set down the box he was carrying and gave her his full attention. The poster had been damaged when a drink spilled across one corner. Emily looked devastated. Daniel knelt beside her on the pavement and carefully examined the damage as though it were the most important project in the world. Within minutes, he had gathered replacement materials from nearby volunteers and helped her rebuild the section. He never treated her frustration as childish. He treated it as real. Emily's smile slowly returned. Victoria watched the exchange from several yards away and felt something shift inside her. It was not the repair that impressed her. It was the patience, the respect, the way Daniel made his daughter feel heard. Later that afternoon, Victoria stopped at a small diner on the edge of town for lunch. To her surprise, she spotted Daniel and Emily seated in a corner booth. She considered leaving. Instead, she chose a table several rows away. Neither noticed her. During the meal, Emily excitedly talked about school, science projects, and a class presentation. Daniel listened attentively between bites of food. When Emily mentioned the upcoming field trip, Victoria noticed a brief shadow cross Daniel's face before he smiled and encouraged her to keep working hard. The moment lasted only a second, but it felt significant. Something told Victoria there was a worry hiding behind that smile. As they prepared to leave, Emily accidentally dropped a folder. Papers scattered across the floor. Before Daniel could gather them, Victoria stepped forward and helped. Emily thanked her politely. Daniel recognized her immediately. For a brief moment, both seemed surprised by the encounter. "Your poster turned out great," Victoria told Emily. The girl's eyes widened. "You saw it." Victoria nodded. Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. "Thank you for helping." The conversation was simple, yet it marked the first real connection between them. No business. No vealt. No discussion about the wallet. Just three people standing beside a diner booth. On the drive home, Victoria found herself thinking less about the $40,000 and more about the way Daniel treated his daughter. She had spent years leading companies and evaluating people. Yet she could not remember the last time she saw someone offer that kind of steady attention to another human being. Meanwhile, Daniel remained uncertain about her growing interest. That evening, after checking the mailbox and sorting through another stack of bills, he noticed a notice from Emily's school. The deadline for the field trip payment had arrived sooner than expected. He quietly folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Across town, Victoria opened a report prepared by her assistant. Most of it contained ordinary information: volunteer work, employment history, community involvement. But one line near the bottom stopped her cold. Years earlier, Daniel had declined a highly regarded engineering position with a major company. No explanation was listed. Victoria stared at the screen, because for the first time she realized the man everyone saw today might not be the whole story. And she suddenly wanted to know what he had given up and why. Victoria Bennett told herself she needed to stop investigating Daniel Harper. The curiosity had already become difficult to explain. Yet every answer seemed to create two new questions. The report mentioning the engineering position remained open on her laptop long after midnight. A man who could have pursued a prestigious technical career now spent his days repairing equipment and stretching every dollar to support his daughter. The decision did not fit the story people usually told about ambition. It felt like an unfinished chapter. Meanwhile, Daniel faced a problem that could not be postponed much longer. Emily's field trip payment was due within days. The amount itself was manageable under normal circumstances, but normal had disappeared months ago. A specialist appointment, rising utility bills, and repairs on the aging pickup truck had slowly narrowed every financial margin. One evening after Emily fell asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table reviewing expenses. He quietly crossed out a note he had written to himself about replacing the truck's brakes before winter. The field trip stayed. His own needs could wait. The next morning, another envelope waited inside the mailbox. Emily noticed the concern in his eyes when he opened it. "Everything okay?" she asked. Daniel smiled gently. "Just grown-up paperwork." She nodded, though she was old enough to know that grown-up paperwork often meant worry. Later that week, an unexpected misunderstanding created a new obstacle. Victoria's assistant, concerned about her employer's unusual interest in Daniel, contacted someone at the manufacturing facility where he worked. The conversation was harmless, but rumors spread quickly. By Friday afternoon, several coworkers had begun speculating that Daniel was somehow connected to a wealthy CEO. One even joked that returning the wallet had been the smartest financial move he ever made. Daniel laughed politely and changed the subject, but the comments left him uncomfortable. He had never wanted attention. He certainly did not want people assuming kindness came with expectations. Across town, Victoria learned what happened and immediately regretted, allowing her curiosity to involve other people. For the first time, she worried she might be making Daniel's life harder instead of understanding it. Yet later that afternoon, she witnessed something that complicated her feelings even further. While driving past a grocery store, she spotted Daniel helping an exhausted young mother load groceries into her car while managing 2 small children. No cameras. No audience. No reason except simple kindness. She remained parked for several minutes watching the interaction unfold. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. Still, doubt lingered. People often showed their best side in public. She wondered what she was not seeing. That question followed her into the weekend. Saturday morning brought another community event at the church parking lot. Daniel arrived early to help set up tables. Emily accompanied him, carrying supplies and greeting familiar volunteers. Midway through the morning, one of the older volunteers suddenly became dizzy and nearly collapsed. Daniel immediately stepped forward, guided him safely into a chair, checked his condition, and calmly coordinated assistance until medical personnel arrived. The efficiency surprised everyone nearby. It was not panic. It was experience. Victoria noticed it too. The response felt practiced, almost instinctive. Later, while the event continued, she quietly asked another volunteer if Daniel had medical training. The woman shook her head. Not officially, but when his wife was sick years ago, he practically lived in hospital waiting rooms. He learned more than most people realize. Victoria fell silent. Another piece of the puzzle had surfaced. Another glimpse of a life shaped by sacrifice. Yet as she watched Daniel laughing with Emily beneath the autumn sunlight, she sensed an even deeper truth remained hidden. And she had no idea that within days, a discovery involving Emily's school would force both of them to confront it. The discovery arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon inside the school hallway, and it changed the way Victoria Bennett would see Daniel Harper forever. Emily's teacher had organized a small display of student projects, celebrating important people in their lives. Parents were invited to stop by after school. Victoria happened to be there for a charitable education initiative sponsored by her company. She had no reason to visit Emily's classroom, yet somehow she found herself drawn there anyway. The room was filled with colorful posters, family photographs, and handwritten essays. One project immediately caught her attention. Across the top, written in careful 10-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My hero." Beneath them was a photograph of Daniel standing beside his aging pickup truck. Victoria smiled at first. Then she began reading. Emily wrote about how her father woke up before sunrise every day, how he packed lunches, fixed broken things, attended every school event, and never missed a doctor appointment. None of that surprised Victoria. What stopped her was the final section. Emily described learning from her grandmother that her father once turned down a dream engineering career because his wife became seriously ill and their family needed him at home. "He says family is more important than plans," Emily had written. "I think he could have been anything. He chose to be my dad." Victoria stood motionless long after other parents moved on to different displays. Suddenly the report on her desk, the rumors, the volunteer work, and the returned wallet all connected into a single picture. Daniel's honesty was not an isolated decision. It was the result of years spent choosing responsibility over personal ambition. Outside, students poured toward waiting vehicles while yellow school buses lined the curb. Victoria remained inside, unexpectedly emotional. Later that afternoon, she noticed Daniel arriving to pick Emily up. He greeted teachers by name, listened patiently as Emily described her day, and carried her oversized project board to the pickup truck. He never saw Victoria watching from across the parking lot. That evening brought another unexpected turn. On her way home, Victoria stopped at a small diner and found herself seated in a booth near 2 retired men discussing Daniel. One mentioned how he had quietly repaired a furnace for a widowed neighbor during winter without accepting payment. The other recalled Daniel spending nights in a hospital waiting room years ago, while caring for his wife. Neither story had been shared publicly. Neither sounded exaggerated. They simply spoke about him as someone dependable. Someone who always showed up when people needed help. For the first time, Victoria felt ashamed of her original assumptions. She had followed Daniel expecting to discover a hidden motive. Instead, she kept finding evidence of hidden sacrifice. Yet the most important revelation came 2 days later. While reviewing records connected to her company's scholarship foundation, Victoria discovered something unexpected. Years earlier, a local engineering firm had personally recommended Daniel for an advanced training program reserved for exceptional candidates. The recommendation described him as one of the most gifted problem solvers they had ever evaluated. He declined the offer less than a week later. No explanation was attached. Victoria stared at the document for a long time. Hidden beneath the maintenance uniform was not only a devoted father, but someone who had willingly stepped away from a completely different future. The discovery changed everything. It deepened her respect. It also created a new question. What exactly had forced him to make that choice? The answer arrived sooner than either of them expected. On Friday afternoon, Emily's school called Daniel unexpectedly. By the time he reached the office, he learned the science field trip deadline had passed. The payment had not been received. Emily sat quietly in a chair near the principal's office, trying not to cry. And for the first time in years, Daniel faced a moment where all his sacrifices might not be enough. The disappointment in Emily's eyes stayed with Daniel Harper all weekend. She tried to be brave after learning she would miss the science field trip. But fathers noticed the things children worked hard to hide. When Daniel picked her up from the school office that Friday afternoon, she smiled and said it was not a big deal. Yet during the drive home in the pickup truck, she stared quietly out the window instead of talking about her day. That silence hurt more than any complaint could have. Daniel spent that evening at the kitchen table reviewing every bill, every receipt, and every expense. The field trip payment had slipped past him during a week filled with overtime shifts, medical paperwork, and repairs at home. It was his mistake. He accepted that. The problem was finding a way to fix it. The following Monday brought new pressure at work. A critical system failure shut down part of the manufacturing facility. Supervisors, engineers, and outside contractors struggled to identify the cause. Hours passed without progress. Production delays mounted. Finally, Daniel asked permission to inspect the system himself. Several people exchanged doubtful looks. He was a maintenance worker, not one of the engineers brought in to solve the problem. Yet within an hour, he identified a hidden fault buried deep inside the equipment network. The solution worked immediately. Production resumed. The visiting consultants seemed surprised. One even asked where Daniel received his engineering training. Daniel simply smiled and returned to his duties. Word spread quickly through the facility. For the first time, coworkers began questioning how someone with that level of technical understanding ended up in his current position. Meanwhile, Victoria Bennett learned about the incident through a board member whose company worked with the plant. The story matched everything else she had been discovering. Every time Daniel faced a challenge, unexpected competence emerged beneath the surface. Yet he never used it to elevate himself. He used it to help others. The pattern fascinated her. Later that week, Victoria happened to visit a grocery store after work. Near the entrance, she spotted Daniel helping an elderly man whose car battery had failed in the parking lot. 10 minutes later, the vehicle was running again. Daniel accepted nothing in return except a handshake. Victoria remained inside her own car, watching quietly. The more she learned, the less she understood why someone like him seemed determined to stay invisible. At home, another envelope arrived in the mailbox. This one carried encouraging news. Emily's teacher had managed to secure a brief extension for the field trip payment. The deadline was not completely lost after all. Daniel felt relief, but only briefly. He still needed the money. That evening, he skipped dinner at his usual diner and picked up additional repair work for a neighbor instead. The extra income would help. Emily noticed. "You are working more because of me," she said softly. Daniel looked up from a toolbox and smiled. "I am working because taking care of you is my job." She hugged him before returning inside. Across town, Victoria found herself thinking about that moment despite never witnessing it. Somehow she could almost predict his response. Responsibility always seemed to guide his choices. Yet the most surprising development arrived 2 days later. While reviewing archived scholarship records connected to local schools, Victoria discovered that an anonymous donor had quietly covered educational expenses for multiple children over the years. The donations began shortly after Daniel's wife passed away. The donor's identity was hidden. But one detail stood out. Every contribution was delivered through a small community foundation, located near the same church parking lot, where Daniel volunteered. Victoria stared at the records for several minutes. Because for the first time, she began to wonder whether some of the kindness changing other families' lives might somehow be connected to the man who could barely afford his own. And if she was right, the truth behind Daniel Harper was about to become much bigger than anyone imagined. Victoria Bennett spent most of the week trying to disprove her own theory. The anonymous donations connected to the community foundation did not make sense. Daniel Harper struggled to pay ordinary bills. He drove an aging pickup truck, worked overtime whenever possible, and carefully stretched every dollar. Yet the timeline kept bothering her. The donations had started shortly after his wife passed away and continued for years. Small amounts, never enough to attract attention, always directed toward children whose families face financial hardship. Victoria requested additional records through the foundation's director, expecting to find another donor. Instead, she found a pattern. Every contribution came through a trust account established by a woman named Sarah Harper, Daniel's late mother. The trust had contained only a modest amount of money. Most families would have used it to stabilize their own finances. Daniel had done something different. On a cool Thursday evening, Victoria drove to the church parking lot and met privately with the foundation director. What she learned left her speechless. Years earlier, after losing his wife, Daniel had inherited a small amount from his mother's estate. Rather than spending it entirely on himself, he quietly divided the money. Part went toward Emily's future. The rest funded educational assistance for struggling children in the community. The donations were anonymous because Daniel insisted they remain that way. He always says children should not have fewer opportunities because adults are having a hard season, the director explained. Victoria stared at the paperwork. Suddenly the returned wallet, the volunteer work, the field trip concerns, and the countless acts of kindness formed a single picture. Daniel did not help people because he had extra resources. He helped people because he understood what it felt like to need help. Meanwhile, Daniel remained completely unaware of what Victoria had discovered. His attention was focused elsewhere. The extended deadline for Emily's field trip payment was approaching again. He had nearly gathered the necessary amount through overtime work and side repairs. Nearly. One Friday afternoon, he stopped at the mailbox before heading inside. Another utility bill waited there. The amount was larger than expected. For several moments he stood quietly on the porch holding the envelope. Then he folded it, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and walked inside with a smile for Emily. She never saw the worry. Later that evening at their favorite diner, Emily excitedly talked about the field trip while Daniel listened. The conversation drifted toward her late mother. Emily asked what she had been like before becoming sick. Daniel answered patiently, sharing small stories and happy memories. A nearby waitress overheard part of the conversation and quietly brought Emily an extra slice of pie. Daniel thanked her warmly. Even in difficult moments, he never allowed hardship to make him bitter. Across town, Victoria found herself thinking about the diner, the trust fund, and the life Daniel could have lived. For the first time, admiration became something deeper. Respect. Not for what he had achieved but for what he had chosen. Yet a new obstacle was already forming. Rumors about Victoria's growing interest in Daniel had begun circulating among business associates and members of the community. Some questioned his motives. Others assumed he was benefiting from her attention. The assumptions were unfair, but they were spreading. And the worst part was that Emily overheard part of one conversation outside the school hallway the following Monday. She walked away before anyone noticed her. But when Daniel picked her up that afternoon, something felt different. She was unusually quiet. As they drove home in the pickup truck, she finally asked a question that caught him completely off guard. "Dad, are people saying those things because of me?" And in that moment, Daniel realized the consequences of other people's misunderstandings were beginning to reach the person he had spent his entire life trying to protect. Emily's question lingered in the cab of the pickup truck long after the drive home ended. "Dad, are people saying those things because of me?" Daniel Harper felt his heart sink. Out of every challenge he had faced over the years, This was the one he feared most. Not financial hardship. Not exhaustion. Not sacrifice. The possibility that his daughter might begin carrying burdens that belonged to adults. He pulled the truck into the driveway and sat quietly for a moment before answering. No, sweetheart. People say things because sometimes they do not know the truth. Emily nodded, but her eyes remained uncertain. For the first time, Daniel realized reassurance alone was not enough. The rumors had already reached her. Over the next several days, the distance between them was small but noticeable. Emily still smiled, still hugged him before school. Yet she seemed more thoughtful, more guarded. One afternoon in the school hallway, Daniel arrived to find her sitting alone on a bench while other students waited with friends. She immediately stood when she saw him, but something about her expression told him she had been crying. She insisted she was fine. Daniel wanted to believe her. Instead, worry followed him everywhere. At home, the pressure continued building. Another utility bill arrived in the mailbox. The field trip extension was nearing its final deadline. Overtime hours left him exhausted. Yet none of those concerns mattered as much as Emily's growing silence. One evening, he discovered her school project lying unfinished on the kitchen table. Normally she loved working on science assignments. Now she simply pushed the papers aside. Maybe I should not go on the trip anyway, she said softly. Daniel looked up immediately. Why would you say that? Emily hesitated. Then the truth emerged. Some students had repeated rumors they overheard from adults. They suggested her father was receiving special treatment because of Victoria Bennett. One child even implied the field trip would probably be paid for by the wealthy CEO. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. I do not want people thinking we need somebody to save us. The word struck Daniel harder than any unpaid bill ever could. As she sounded exactly like him. Proud. Independent. Determined to protect her dignity. Later that night, after Emily went to bed, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. The house felt unusually quiet. He stared at the field trip paperwork beside the stack of bills and wondered if every sacrifice had somehow led them here. He had spent years protecting Emily from instability, grief, and disappointment. Yet he could not protect her from the assumptions of other people. Across town, Victoria was facing her own crisis of conscience. After learning the rumors had reached Emily, she felt responsible. Her curiosity had unintentionally drawn attention to a man who never wanted any. For the first time, she considered stepping away completely. Maybe Daniel's life would be easier if she disappeared from it. Yet the more she thought about that solution, the more it felt wrong. The problem was not Daniel. The problem was that people did not know the truth. 3 days later, the final deadline arrived. Daniel managed to gather enough money for the field trip through overtime work and side jobs. He drove to the school determined to submit the payment. But when he reached the office, he learned something unexpected. Emily had already withdrawn her name from the trip that morning. She had signed the form herself. Daniel stood frozen in the principal's office holding the payment envelope. The money was finally there. The opportunity was gone. That evening, Emily barely touched her dinner. Daniel could see the disappointment she was trying to hide. The connection between them felt strained in a way he had never experienced before. And as darkness settled outside the house, a new message arrived in Victoria Bennett's inbox. It contained documents, letters, and testimony from people whose lives had been quietly changed by Daniel Harper over the years. Reading through them, Victoria realized something important. The truth was finally complete. And if it remained hidden any longer, Daniel might lose the very thing he had spent his entire life trying to protect. The turning point arrived on a rainy Thursday evening inside the same school hallway where Emily had quietly withdrawn from the science trip. Daniel Harper had spent days carrying the weight of that decision. Not because of the money. The money had finally been earned through overtime work, late-night repairs, and sacrifices nobody saw. What haunted him was the look in his daughter's eyes when she decided she no longer wanted to be a burden. For the first time since losing her mother, something fragile between them felt broken. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at school after receiving an unexpected call from the principal. He expected another problem. Instead, he found the auditorium filled with students, parents, teachers, and community volunteers. Victoria Bennett stood near the front beside several members of the school board. Daniel immediately felt uncomfortable. Attention was the last thing he wanted. Emily sat quietly in the front row, avoiding eye contact. Victoria stepped forward and began speaking. She explained that the school had been preparing a community recognition event, focused on local acts of service and integrity. Then she started telling a story. She spoke about a man who returned $40,000 without accepting a reward. A man who volunteered at food drives in the church parking lot. A man who quietly funded educational assistance for children through his late mother's trust. A man who sacrificed a promising engineering career to care for his sick wife and raise his daughter. The room gradually fell silent. Daniel lowered his eyes. He never wanted these things discussed publicly. But Victoria continued. Not to praise him. To tell the truth. One by one people stood. The elderly woman whose furnace he repaired. The volunteer from the food pantry. Parents whose children had received anonymous educational support. Co-workers from the manufacturing plant who had watched him solve problems nobody else could solve. Each shared a small piece of the life Daniel had spent years building quietly. No single story seemed extraordinary by itself. Together, they revealed something remarkable. Not success. Character. Emily listened to every word. Tears slowly filled her eyes as she realized how much of her father's life had remained invisible even to her. The final speaker was the principal. He held up the science trip form Emily had submitted days earlier. Then he explained that the field trip had never truly been about money. Teachers had already arranged assistance through existing school programs. Emily had withdrawn because she believed people would think her father needed rescuing. At that moment, Victoria gently handed the microphone to Emily. The room grew completely still. Emily stood trembling for a moment before speaking. I thought people only saw my dad as someone who worked hard because he had to, she said softly. I did not know how many people he helped when nobody was watching. She looked directly at Daniel. I am sorry I stopped believing that the truth would matter. Daniel felt years of exhaustion, sacrifice, grief, and love collide inside his chest. He crossed the room and wrapped his daughter in his arms. Neither spoke for several seconds. They did not need to. The room remained silent except for quiet tears and gentle applause. It was the kind of silence that comes when people finally understand something important. Later that evening, after the event ended, Daniel and Emily stopped at their favorite diner. The same booth. The same simple meal. Yet everything felt different. Lighter. Healthier. Whole. Emily talked excitedly about rejoining the field trip. Daniel listened, smiling more than he had in weeks. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Across the parking lot, Victoria prepared to leave. Before getting into her car, she paused beside Daniel's pickup truck. You changed a lot of lives, she said. Daniel shook his head gently. People helped me when I needed it. I just tried to pass it along. Victoria smiled. For the first time, she understood that his hidden competence was never the engineering talent, the technical skill, or the problem-solving ability everyone admired. Those things mattered. But his greatest strength had always been something else. He consistently chose responsibility over convenience, integrity over opportunity, and love over self-interest. Months later, another envelope arrived in Daniel's mailbox. This one contained confirmation that Emily had been selected for an advanced science program based on her own work and determination. As he watched her run across the yard waving the letter, Daniel thought about everything they had survived together. Loss, doubt, sacrifice, misunderstanding. Yet somehow they had arrived here. Not because of luck. Not because someone powerful rescued them. Because love endured. Because character mattered. Because quiet dignity leaves a mark long after words disappear. And as father and daughter stood together beneath the evening sky, the future finally felt less like something they had to survive and more like something they could hope for.